In this video, we'll explore how midwifery has changed from pre-industrial community care to modern regulated practice, and how wider societal shifts like industrialisation shape childbirth. Let's begin with pre-industrial midwifery. At this time, midwifery and childbirth were almost exclusively the domain of women. Birth was a communal event, deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life, and childbirth was not only seen as a medical event, but a deeply moral and spiritual experience. It was something that was supported by relatives, neighbours and friends, with knowledge passed down through lived experience rather than formal education. Babies were born at home. This was simply the expected place to give birth, and labour progressed at its own pace, attended by women, and generally only women. Midwives often worked informally and part-time, serving their communities as needed. Some trained through apprenticeships, with more experienced midwives gradually becoming more established in their role. However, the majority may have not had any formal training and simply been inexperienced older women. Their work patterns were varied and responsive to the rhythms of community life. The birthing woman was typically surrounded by a group of local women, later referred to as birth attendants or gossips. These women were married, had given birth themselves, and were experienced in supporting others through childbirth. Often the woman's own mother was present, along with close friends, and these attendants played multiple roles. They assisted with the birth, called for help when needed, they cared for the newborn, and importantly, their role didn't end with the birth. During the 4-week recovery period, known as lying in, these women ensured the new mother was properly rested and recovering well. They also served an informal but vital regulatory function, overseeing the actions of any midwife present. From the early 16th century, episcopal licensing became a requirement for midwives. To obtain a license, a midwife had to serve as a deputy to a licensed practitioner, similar to apprenticeships seen in surgery and apothecary work at the time. Applicants paid a significant fee, underwent an examination, either by the bishop or someone with obstetric experience, and provided testimonials from local medical professionals, clergy, and the women that they had delivered. In fact, the evidence required to prove a midwife's fitness to practice was more demanding than that required of a physician or a surgeon seeking a similar licence. However, not all midwives were licensed, and in fact many weren't. Life during this period followed natural cycles of work and rest, which aligned well with the unpredictability of childbirth. Midwives were accustomed to being called at all hours to attend. And before the Industrial Revolution, most people in the UK worked seasonally, in harmony with the sun and the land. There were no clocks. People worked according to the needs of the day, harvesting, tending animals and completing hours during daylight hours. In 1671, Jane Sharp published the Midwife's Book of the Whole Art of Midwifery Discovered. This is the first midwifery manual in English and is written by a woman, which is really important. Sharp's work defended women's knowledge at the time, particularly when men were beginning to enter the field. The Industrial Revolution marked a turning point in midwifery and childbirth. From around the 17th century, we begin to see significant changes, one of the most notable being the increasing involvement of men in childbirth. Initially, male surgeons were only called upon in emergencies, particularly in the case of obstructed labour, where the midwife was unable to reposition the baby and the mother's life was at risk. In these cases, the infant had sadly normally passed, and it was about saving the mother's life. As medicine became more professionalised, men began to take on more active roles in childbirth, and this is part of asserting professional boundaries. Around this time, the Chamberlain family also developed the obstetric forceps, one of the first meaningful medical tools that could potentially save the life of a baby during delivery. This innovation allowed medical practitioners to intervene more directly in births and have legitimacies to be with birthing women. The development of such technology, combined with the rising social status of medicine, helped normalise the presence of male doctors in childbirth. Over time, their involvement became less associated with fear and death and more accepted as part of medical progress. But industrialisation didn't just change medicine, it transformed society. Work was no longer guided by natural rhythms, but by factory schedules. Artificial lighting disrupted sleep cycles and enabled continuous night shifts. And these changes had profound impact on childbirth practices. In hospitals, labour began to be scheduled and managed according to institutional timetables rather than the unpredictable pace of the birthing body. And childbirth shifted from home, as hospitals became more associated with advances in medical care, and childbirth shifted from the home, where it was flexible, woman-led and tuned to natural cycles, to the hospital, where it became more structured and controlled. We also see a more formal regulation of midwifery at the turn of the 20th century. In 1902, the Midwives Act established the Central Midwives Board. For the first time, midwives were formally regulated, but their scope of practice was restricted to normal births, and any complications had to be handed over to a doctor. Supervision came from middle-class inspectors, many with little experience of childbirth, and midwives themselves were excluded from the board and decision-making until 1920, and even then they remained in the minority. So whilst midwifery was legitimised on paper, the real authority remained with doctors, reflecting the gender and class hierarchies at the time. Also of importance is the NHS Act from 1946. This created the NHS, and with this all women gained free access to both doctors and midwives. General practitioners began to take on antenatal care due to the payment structure, although many left actual birth to the midwives. And post-war Britain emphasised efficiency and standardisation in healthcare, values that mirrored industrial society. Birth really became embedded in the larger system, where professional authority and hospital infrastructure are central. Regulation changed again around 2000, so the Central Midwives Board was abolished in 1979, and by 2002, midwifery was regulated under the Nursing and Midwifery Council. And many midwives still feel that their professional voice is overshadowed by nursing interests. The changing patterns of maternity care over the 20th century have provided challenges for both women and midwives, and this is reflected in policy. In 1970, the Peel Report recommended hospital births for all women, citing safety. And culturally this is important because at the time this is a post-war environment. There may be very high levels of poverty, people may be living in unsanitary housing and have generally low levels of population health compared to today. This report further entrenched the medical model of childbirth and accelerated the decline of home births. The technologies and interventions, which became more commonplace in the late 60s and 70s, such as induction, the use of syntocinon, electronic heart rate monitoring, ultrasound and episiotomies, as well as an increased proportion of obstetricians employed within maternity services, all impacted on women's experience of childbirth, but also the autonomy of midwives. The increasingly technological approach to birth has largely followed the pattern of change in the United States of America, where intervention in birth became the norm in advance of that in Britain. But by 1990, the Changing Childbirth Report in 1993 marked a significant cultural shift. It emphasised choice, continuity and women's control, and was heavily influenced by second-wave feminists. And this signalled a move back to more holistic care. Better Births followed this up in 2015. There are more reports in between, but this is also highly significant for reinforcing choice and continuity in maternity services. Today, most midwives work in hospitals, which is a legacy of the industrial centralisation and policy changes we've seen. But there is a growing interest in independent midwifery and increasing rates of home births, reviving some of the traditions of earlier centuries. Medical advances have made childbirth much safer, but some argue that over-medicalisation disempowers women and treats a natural process as an illness. The history of midwifery also reflects broader societal questions. Should human life and childbirth be managed by industrial values of efficiency and control, or should we embrace natural biological rhythms and community-centred care? Thank you for watching. This short video is a short history of midwifery. It's worth noting that this is specific to the UK and doesn't reflect a wide range of childbirth practices around the globe, nor the diversity of childbirth practices that we see in the UK today.